He planned for the cameras. He planned for the DNA. He planned for every layer of forensic science investigators could throw at him. He never planned for the one thing he forgot to take off his own hand. This is the story of the ring that could end the search for Nancy Guthrie's kidnapper. The kidnapper planned everything. The mask, the gloves, the backpack, the surveillance, even the way he communicated. Every detail was designed, in advance, to leave investigators with nothing to work with. No fingerprint, no fiber, no digital trail, no witness who could place him at the scene. And for months, it looked like he had succeeded. Months of silence. Months of a case that seemed to be moving sideways instead of forward. Months where the public's hope rose and fell with every new headline. Then investigators enhanced a single frame of doorbell footage and noticed something he never meant anyone to see. One small mistake, one flash of metal, one clue that, on its own, looks almost insignificant, and yet may be the thing that brings down the entire operation. We're going to break down every single thing, every piece of evidence, every decision this man made, and the one decision he didn't realize he was making at all. The entire country was watching. Every true crime community, every analyst, every journalist who had camped outside a house in Tucson for weeks, every person sitting at home refreshing their phone, waiting for the DNA results that might break the case open. 3 weeks of waiting. 3 weeks of national attention locked onto a single piece of physical evidence. 3 weeks of a family holding its breath, of investigators managing public expectations, of a grieving community hoping the forensic science would deliver what the physical search had not. When the results finally came back, they were almost anticlimactic. A restaurant worker, cleared. Zero connection to Nancy Guthrie. Zero connection to the night of January 31st, 2026. A piece of discarded cloth in an open field 2 miles from her home, carrying DNA that belonged to someone with nothing to do with any of this. The glove was a dead end. And while every camera in America was pointed at that dead end, while every headline was processing what it meant, a separate set of eyes in a room somewhere in Tucson was doing something quieter, more methodical, something the kidnapper had not accounted for. They were going back through the doorbell footage, not just the parts already released, all of it, frame by frame. Not looking for anything specific, just looking for anything at all. Any detail that 44 seconds of compressed night vision footage might be concealing inside its pixels that hadn't been caught the first time. This is the unglamorous side of investigative work that never makes it into the headlines. Just people sitting at desks, running the same 44 seconds of footage over and over, adjusting contrast, isolating frames, looking for the thing that doesn't belong. And on the front porch of an 84-year-old woman who was about to be taken from her own home, in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, they found it. Not the glove, not the mask, not the backpack, a ring, a wideband metallic glint underneath the fabric of his glove, catching the night vision light in a way that the flat profile of a covered hand simply shouldn't catch. A shape, a suggestion of something personal, something permanent, something that belonged to the human being underneath the mask, not to the operation, not to the plan, not to the meticulous layer of forensic countermeasures this man had built around himself before he walked up to that porch in the dark. He wore the ring to the crime. And that one quiet human imperfection, sitting inside an otherwise surgically constructed operation, may be the thing that ends this. To understand why a single ring matters this much, you have to understand the level of preparation this man brought to everything else. This was not a person acting on impulse. Every choice he made before stepping onto that porch points to planning, discipline, and an unusually sophisticated understanding of how modern investigations work. He chose a ski mask, full face coverage, black, purchased somewhere in a retail environment that carries its own documentation trail if you know how to pursue it. Not an improvised covering pulled up in a moment of opportunity, but a purpose-built mask chosen specifically to eliminate any facial recognition risk. He chose a Walmart Ozark Trail 25L backpack, a product that sells in the millions of units annually, specifically because its commercial ubiquity makes individual purchase tracking nearly impossible through standard retail record requests. This is someone who understood that investigators would eventually try to trace the backpack, and who deliberately picked the hardest one in the country to trace. He chose a holster configuration that investigators noted is associated with specific tactical training backgrounds, speaking not to a casual opportunist, but as someone with working knowledge of how professionals carry concealed weapons when a standard waistband setup would be detectable on camera. He used walkie-talkies, not cell phones, not encrypted apps, radio frequency devices that produce no cellular tower data, no metadata trail, no recoverable digital communication record. He made that choice because he understood how federal investigations actually track criminal communication in 2026 and exactly where the digital surveillance net had holes. He had been to this house before. The footage shows it, the approach pattern, the knowledge of the camera positions, the specific action he took to interfere with the Ring device on the porch. All of it reflects prior physical reconnaissance of the property. He scouted this house across multiple visits in the weeks before he moved, a pre-incident surveillance pattern documented across multiple days. This man spent serious, disciplined, professional time on this. He built countermeasures for every layer of the forensic architecture he could identify: the DNA, the cameras, the digital trail, the communication intercept risk, the vehicle, the backpack, the mask, the holster, the gloves. He thought about everything. Except the ring. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it's the entire point of this story. A person capable of selecting a backpack specifically because of its market saturation, capable of choosing radio communication specifically because of its lack of metadata, capable of multiple reconnaissance visits to map camera angles, still walked up to that porch wearing a piece of personal jewelry he had probably worn every single day for years without thinking about it once. You can plan around evidence. It's much harder to plan around habit. Now understand what a ring actually represents in a forensic investigation, because it is not simply a visual detail. It is a different category of evidence entirely, with a different set of investigative possibilities than almost anything else recovered in this case so far. A ring is not biological material deposited on a discarded item in an uncontrolled outdoor environment. It isn't subject to the same contamination variables, the same transfer by contact ambiguities, the same defense arguments about secondary DNA deposit that made the glove evidence so limited. A ring is a manufactured object. It has physical characteristics that can be described with precision: bandwidth, material composition, setting style, stone type if present, or pattern, surface finish. Those characteristics can be cross-referenced against retail databases, custom order histories, pawn shop inventories, jewelry maker records. The kind of documentary trail a careful criminal doesn't think to scrub because he doesn't know anyone saw it in the first place. You can't destroy evidence of a purchase you don't realize anyone is looking for. More importantly than any of that, a ring is personal. It isn't disposable equipment purchased for the crime and discarded after, the way the mask or gloves were likely meant to be. A ring is something that exists in the actual life of the person who wore it, bought or received at a specific moment, reflecting a specific personal taste, possibly tied to a relationship or family tradition. Something someone who knows this person might recognize immediately the second it's described in precise enough terms. That is the real power of this piece of evidence. It connects a private, personal detail of someone's life to a crime scene. And personal details get recognized by the people who actually know that person. Police showed up at his door the next morning, but the ring wasn't on his hand. It was already somewhere else, out in a field, far from the porch where it had been seen on camera. But whatever became of it physically, the moment it was spotted on that porch changed everything about how this case was being worked. The platform meant to protect neighborhoods, the Ring doorbell system itself, had become part of the evidence trail against the very person trying to defeat it. This was a fundamentally different category of evidence than anything recovered up to that point, and investigators understood that immediately. Sheriff Nanos, when asked about the ring publicly, gave exactly the kind of response law enforcement gives when they're actively pursuing something they aren't ready to confirm in detail. He said he was looking at the same photo the public was looking at. He said he saw it. He said he was going to give it to his team, that they would analyze it, that they would see what it told them. He wasn't dismissing it as nothing. He was protecting it as something. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Officials don't say that's nothing about evidence they've ruled out. They say in careful, measured language that they're looking at it, that their team will analyze it, that they'll see what comes of it. That is the language of an active lead, not a dead end. While the ring was generating forensic analysis in one direction, something else entirely was happening inside Nancy Guthrie's home itself. A separate evidence stream developing in parallel, quietly, without the same level of public attention the ring photo was receiving. On February 18, 2026, the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed the discovery of non-victim DNA inside the house. Not on a discarded object in a field 2 miles away. Not at the perimeter of the property. Inside the home where Nancy Guthrie lived, slept, and was taken from. Biological material that didn't belong to Nancy, that didn't match any member of her immediate family, and that couldn't be attributed to anyone with documented, legitimate residential access to that home. It's worth pausing to explain why this distinction, interior versus exterior evidence, matters so much. When you find DNA in a controlled residential environment, where access patterns are documented and the population of people with legitimate reasons to be present is known and limited, you're dealing with evidence that is fundamentally harder to explain away than DNA recovered outdoors. A stranger's DNA on a fence post in a field can be argued about for hours. A stranger's DNA inside a locked private residence is a much harder thing to explain. Nanos confirmed the DNA wasn't connected to anyone in Nancy's close family circle. He was careful with his language throughout, as officials in active investigations typically are, but the confirmation itself stands as one of the most significant forensic statements made publicly in this entire investigation. Because what it actually means is that the biological identity of at least one person who was inside Nancy Guthrie's home the night she disappeared, a person with no legitimate reason to be there, is preserved somewhere in the evidence chain. That identity is being pursued through genetic genealogy. For anyone unfamiliar with the method, genetic genealogy doesn't require a direct hit in a federal criminal database, and it doesn't require that the contributor has ever been arrested or entered into CODIs. Instead, it works by identifying partial profile matches to relatives through public genealogy databases like GeneMatch and 23andMe, building out a family tree, then narrowing down to a specific individual through traditional investigative techniques. It took genetic genealogy decades to fully mature as an investigative tool, but once properly applied, it has broken investigations in months that have been cold for decades. It placed Brian Koberger in an Idaho house before a single investigator had his name attached to anything. In the Nancy Guthrie case, investigators confirmed they were pursuing this methodology alongside the ring evidence and the enhanced doorbell analysis simultaneously. They were not putting all their weight on one thread. They were pulling several at once, understanding that in a case this sophisticated, identification was most likely going to come from convergence, the point where 2 or 3 independent evidence streams, developed separately, end up pointing at the exact same person at the exact same time. And then the picture expanded again. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's Ring camera, separate entirely from the primary doorbell footage that had already been made public, appeared to show a second individual in the vicinity of Nancy's property around the time of the abduction. Not one person, 2. For investigators, this wasn't actually a surprise. The walkie-talkies had already suggested this was a multi-person operation. You don't use radio coordination devices for a solo extraction. If this had been one person acting alone, there would have been no one on the other end of that radio. But while the second figure wasn't a surprise to investigators, publicly it added an entirely new dimension to the evidence picture. 2 people means 2 potential biological profiles at the scene, 2 sets of device signatures, 2 distinct movement patterns across the approach and departure routes, 2 individual human beings who each made their own choices that night about what they wore, what they carried, and what they failed to think through, the same way this man failed to think through his ring. There was also a blood deposit found on a rock near the property, separate from the blood discovered on the front porch, and confirmed early in the investigation to belong to Nancy herself. A separate location investigators were treating as operationally significant to understanding how the people involved moved around the property that night. Each piece of evidence, taken individually, narrows the profile slightly. Taken together, each new detail adds specificity to the overall picture of who these people were and what they did. On June 9, 2026, 130 days after the abduction, the investigation was officially reclassified as a homicide inquiry. On June 22nd, NBC News, CBS News, ABC News, CNN, BBC, and Fox News simultaneously reported what investigators had actually known internally since February 6th, just 5 days after Nancy was taken. She had died shortly after the abduction. The note investigators received said they did not intend for it to happen. It said she was buried in nature. It made no further demand. It offered no exchange arrangement. It asked for nothing else at all. 3 sentences, and then silence that has now stretched on for months. The phrase buried in nature is not just emotionally devastating. It is also, in investigative terms, operationally specific. It eliminates structures and urban environments and points search efforts toward remote outdoor terrain, desert, mountain, dry wash, federal land. Southern Arizona, in every direction outward from Tucson, is exactly the kind of landscape. The Santa Catalinas to the north, the Sonoran Desert to the south and west, the Rincon Range to the east. Thousands of acres of terrain that could easily contain an unmarked burial site, invisible to anything except a deliberate, targeted search. Buscando Corazones Nogales, the Mexican volunteer search organization credited with recovering more than 2,000 victims across the border region, had already been active in this case near Nogales, Sonora, following an anonymous tip. They found 25 separate unmarked graves, none connected to Nancy. But the reclassification to homicide, combined with the public confirmation that the note acknowledged a burial, gives every ongoing search operation a new and far more specific mandate than the missing persons framing could ever provide. The FBI's earlier deployment of signal sniffer technology, helicopter-mounted equipment designed to detect the unique frequency emitted by a pacemaker device, had been made while investigators still held open, at least publicly, the possibility that Nancy was alive somewhere. Her pacemaker's monitoring signal stopped transmitting at approximately 2 a.m. on February 1st, telling investigators not just that something had happened, but roughly when. Now, knowing what the note said and what investigators have since confirmed, the search is oriented toward one single objective: a burial site somewhere in the vast natural terrain of southern Arizona, where a family is waiting to go and bring their mother home. Here is everything that exists in this case right now, laid out together. This case has the glove DNA, already cleared. It has the interior DNA, still unidentified, being processed through genetic genealogy. It has the ring, cross-referenced against jewelry retail and custom order databases. It has the enhanced doorbell footage, which provides a far more complete physical description than investigators had in the earliest days. The ring, the holster position, the backpack model, an estimate of build and height, and a black mustache visible at the edge of the mask. It has the second suspect, captured on a neighbor's camera. It has the blood deposit on the rock. It has a note confirming both a death and a category of burial location. And it has the ongoing perjury allegations against Sheriff Nanos, whose removal process is expected to produce sworn testimony carrying real legal consequences for dishonesty in a way ordinary press conference statements never could. Every single one of these threads is still live. Every evidence stream is still actively being worked by investigators. The investigation has not reached a conclusion because no arrest has been made. But the accumulation of what exists across this evidence chain, physical, forensic, digital, and testimonial, is steadily building toward a convergence point. The man who wore that ring thought he was invisible. He thought the gloves would cover his hands. He thought the mask would cover his face. He thought the walkie-talkies would cover his communications. He thought the backpack, chosen specifically for its anonymity, would cover his purchase history. He thought the holster would say nothing identifiable about who he actually was. He didn't think about the ring. He didn't think about the way a personal item, worn out of nothing more than habit or sentiment or simple unconscious routine, would end up surviving every single deliberate countermeasure he built around himself. He didn't think that someone, weeks later, in a quiet room, would enhance a single frame of footage and catch a glint of metal underneath the fabric of his glove that simply didn't belong there. He didn't think that rings have histories, that rings can be described in enough detail for someone else to recognize them, that the person who eventually recognizes that description might be someone he actually knows, a friend, a coworker, a family member, someone in his life who reads that description and thinks, I've seen that ring before. I know who wears that ring. That recognition hasn't happened publicly yet, but the investigation knows it can happen, and that possibility is exactly why this case continues to be worked as hard as it is. That's also why the reward sits at over $1 million, because the information most likely to break this case open is going to come from a person out in the world, not a lab result. Someone in a community, someone in a workplace, someone who heard something back in February that they didn't realize at the time was significant. Someone who can place a specific person in a specific location during a specific window of time. Someone who knows a man with a ring. Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home on February 1st, 2026. She died within days of that. She was buried somewhere in the natural terrain of the very land she had spent her life living beside. The people who did this sent 3 sentences and then went completely silent. They believed the mask covered everything. They believed the gloves covered everything. They believed the plan, in its totality, was complete and unbreakable. But the ring was on the hand of a human being, not an operation, not a plan. A person who made one small, quiet, imperfect human choice, failing to take off a personal item before walking up to a porch in the middle of the night, that ended up surviving every other carefully constructed layer of the forensic architecture he had built around himself. That is how cases like this actually break more often than people expect. Not always with a single dramatic moment captured on television. Not always with one clean, sudden breakthrough that resolves everything at once. Sometimes it happens through the slow, methodical accumulation of forensic specificity, thread by thread, frame by frame, database search by database search, until the totality of what has been built points to one specific human being, with no reasonable room left to argue against it. The ring is part of that accumulation. The interior DNA is part of it. The genetic genealogy analysis currently underway is part of it. The second suspect footage is part of it. The note confirming a burial is part of it. None of it, individually, is finished. All of it together is still actively being worked. And the person who wore that ring is still out there right now, living the life they believe this entire plan would protect them from losing. They are wrong. If you know anything, any detail, any recollection, anyone who matches this description, contact the FBI immediately at 1-800-CALL-FBI or report online at tips.fbi.gov. There's over $1 million in combined reward money available, and you can report completely anonymously, with no identification required at any point in the process. Nancy Guthrie's family is still waiting every single day to bring her home.